and I welcome the Minister and his officials to the House for what is, I suppose, the second stage of some very important legislation. And just, to comment on some of the contributions of previous senators, I do agree that we should have a wider debate about local government funding in this House and, to debate the issues surrounding that. But I would point out that with the demand for more services and more powers for local authority members, and indeed more services for the citizens that reside in local authority areas, comes more responsibilities in regards to the raising of finances, whether that be through the collection of commercial rates, local property tax, to improve amenities and services or whatever. And we did see already the controversies that ravaged this country over the past number of years when water rates or water charges were introduced to try and improve essentially water services around the country. We saw the resistance that was there. So it is all very fine to have the debates and to have the demands and to have the improvements of services. But when we have that demand, we must come with a responsible debate and responsible proposals in how we propose to raise the finances to fund those. And I just want to put that out there, because we have had, and I certainly have been experienced, where we try to improve services in this country, there is a resistance, and a strong resistance, when we try to raise, whether it's property taxes or indeed water charges. There is a strong resistance to that. So if we want more services, we have to know how we're going to fund them. Just in relation to this particular bill, and the Minister referenced the Poor Relief Ireland Act of 1838, and it struck me. I remember myself in 2013 bringing a private member's bill to actually amend that act, because there was the scenario at that time where a commercial property transfer was happening and where rates were still outstanding. The actual bill for the rates didn't transfer with the tenant or the person that would have been responsible. It actually stayed with the property at that time. And I'm glad that that actual bill influenced what later became the Local Government Reform Bill of 2014 to address that anomaly. So it is important that we continually evaluate and improve the system of collecting rates in this country to reflect a modern society and to reflect the needs and demands of our local authorities, and indeed the people, which is most important in all of this, the people that our local authorities serve. There is always room for improvement, and I think some members outlined some local authorities where there is inconsistencies with the collection of commercial rates. And I think it is, in a fair system, we need to have a consistent method of collection of rates. I've often had, and I'm sure the Minister and indeed members here have had, businesses coming to them, complaining about the high cost of commercial rates. Well, when people are not paying their dues in commercial rates, well then obviously that charge is going to fall elsewhere. And it is important that we have a fair system of collecting rates, an efficient system of collecting rates, and I think this legislation is going some way to address that, because local authority performance is something we need to continually measure and monitor. And I know the Minister and his officials in the department have continuous engagement with local authorities in that respect, but it is important that they are monitored and evaluated and indeed measured, and where there are people lacking or where local authorities are lacking, they then need to be addressed. Commercial rates are just one element, but a very significant element of the funding mechanisms for local authorities, which we obviously need to deliver essential services, whether it is amenities, open spaces, public lighting or whatever a local authority prioritises in their respective areas. And it is essential that we indeed modernise that legislation. As I said, some of this goes back to the 19th century. Again, to have some understanding around how the rate system works, and I think the Valuation Office is responsible, as we know, for implementing and maintaining the rating system, and they are quasi-judicial, they're independent almost of any political policy or interference, and I think that needs to be recognised. And I know Waterford a few years ago went through the revaluation. It can be a very stressful time for businesses, because, as we know, and others are learning as they get around the country, there are winners and losers in the revaluation process. We always hear about the losers, but we rarely hear about the winners. And what I mean by that is where some commercial properties see a hike in their commercial rates. There are many others, because obviously it has to balance out, that win, and their rates are reduced. And at those times, we rarely, if seldom, hear about the winners in those circumstances. So that's why I believe, Minister, that we do need possibly a more transparent way of portraying when evaluation happens to avoid controversy. And I think it is in the best interests of public service, to show how the funding is being used that's collected through commercial rates, where it's been spent within the respective local authority areas. And I think there is room for improvement here. In local authorities selling to their ratepayers. These are the people that are funding them, and rather than just going there with the hand out and collecting it, which is their responsibility as a local authority, I believe there is a responsibility on local authorities to show those very same ratepayers, and indeed citizens as well, how their money is being spent. And it can be done in a very simplified system, I believe. I think it's done in other jurisdictions, and I think it's something we should look to introduce here in a better way. Because for a system to be successful, it has to be fair and equitable, and I know this bill is attempting to achieve that. It has to be transparent, but it also has to be sustainable. And if people are not paying for whatever reason, it certainly won't become sustainable, because it goes against the grain of goodwill and the good principle of people paying their rates for better services in the communities that they do business in, and indeed that they reside in as well. And then going back to the local authority, of course, it's the responsibility and the reserved function of local authority members to set the annual rate and valuations at their annual budgetary meetings. And often, as we all know in this House, they can be a place of hot debate where priorities are set and then funding is required to actually meet those priorities. And that requires sometimes setting the rate, and sometimes it's an increase in the commercial rates, and sometimes it may not mean that. So that's down to the members and the powers of elected members to set their priorities in their respective local authorities and then set their annual rate and the valuation, which then is used in the formula to obviously collect the sums of money from the businesses that operate in those areas. There was mention, Minister, of an allowance in this legislation for a waiver alleviation scheme, and I think that is a positive step, but I would caution and guard that it's not abused. Because, again, for political popularity reasons, I'd be afraid that some groups in councils, and I won't name who they might be, might look for waivers left, right and centre. And I don't think that's the intent of the waiver alleviation scheme in this bill. I think it's more for policy objectives within the council, where, for example, they might wish to address an area of decline and they might wish to incentivise new businesses in an area. I think then that is most appropriate, and I think I'd be interested to hear more detail around that particular part of the legislation, and how we can actually target this and ensure that local authorities are using it for the correct reasons, not for political purposes to gain popularity and reducing or bringing in waivers for the sake of it, but rather introducing them to target areas in decline in the local authority areas to, I suppose, stimulate economic regeneration and development in that particular area. And in this later stages, you might be able to address that. So that's generally my points on this. I think we need consistency in re-evaluation to the Valuations Office. I'm just making that point while I have the floor. Vacant properties, I think we need a balance to be struck here. It's fine not to collect rates on vacant properties. Some people feel it's unfair on the owners of the properties where they're struggling to get a business in there, and the local authority are still trying to collect their rates there. Others would argue if there's not an incentive there for them to get a business in there, well then it will remain vacant. So there's a bit of the stick and carrot approach and a bit of balance to be struck, I believe, in that area. I'll finish with this. Local government funding generally. I want to put this on the record. Some people have said and put on the public record, politicians, that they wish for the local property tax that's collected in areas to be retained in those areas. I have a concern around that. I think the principle of equalisation needs to be upheld in terms of funding of local authorities, because we have places like Dublin doing very well, where I consider it's an economic vortex, where businesses are strong and they're financially viable, and then we've other regions in the country where businesses are struggling and the rate collection is not as high in those areas. So weaker regions and weaker local authorities need assistance from stronger areas, and I would just ask you to take that into account, Minister, because we need to be very careful. It's all very well to say we change the funding in local government systems here, but we need to be careful we do not make the weaker any more weaker than they currently are.
Thanks, Senator.